Well, so as the summer progresses, I hope you're still enjoying it. Some of you might not enjoy it as much now because it's getting a little cooler out, which is, to me, my favorite. Today's temperature was in the low 70s, and it was beautiful. Um, Also, I know I keep talking about weather beforehand, but I thought maybe I'd try something a little different and talk about food. Lisa started buying this green called farro. It's Farro. And tonight we had stuffed peppers, stuffed with farro, mushrooms, uh, and squash. And it was delicious. So there's something for you to go out and find. Try something a little different. Uh, it's nice and chewy, it's good flavor. And I don't remember where it's from, but when I eat things like that, these different grains, I usually my mind wanders to the Middle East because I know they're big grain eaters, and sometimes I wonder if the Apostle Paul or Jesus actually ate some of these things. Um, but anyways, it's neat to explore and expand your horizons, and that's kind of what we're doing here with this lesson that we've been talking about, living with the Spirit. So tonight is the fifth installment, and I promised last week we're going to continue on in Romans and get down to uh, verses 9 to 12 or 9 to 13. And actually, we're going to pause for a minute, still talking about living with the Spirit. But last week, I encouraged you to take some time and imagine what the world would look like if the Spirit of God was at work in the world. And so we're going to go through that a little bit tonight. A lot of these are verses you've heard many times. It's probably a lot of review in that sense, but looking at it from a little different angle, different worldview than we often look at now as Christians. I'm talking about general in Christianity. So we're going to start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get right in here. Lord, we thank you for this time that we have to gather, even over distance. It's still amazing to me, Lord, the technology that we've come up with to allow us to do things like this. It could be used very positive in a positive way. I'm very thankful that we have the opportunity to do so. I thank you for your word. I thank you for so many resources that we have, and so many people who have spent time to research and study the things that you have for us, and that we can glean off those folks who have done so. And Lord, when I think about now, I mean, when Jesus was here on the earth, or Paul was on, or the apostles were here, there was a wealth of information from them. And I think now the wealth of information out there is just incredible. And Lord, I have to believe that you and your Spirit are somewhat behind that, at least. And I pray that we don't let these things go to waste, and that we as believers take a sincere interest and take advantage of these things that we have so we can learn more about you. Amen.
Amen.
So we are going to continue on here, living with the Spirit. And like I said, I wanted to pause for a minute and kind of step back from Romans a little bit. At the end, we'll go ahead and read the verses that we're going to look at next week. But before that, last week I had asked you to imagine what the world would look like to you if you knew that the Spirit of God was working in the world. And unfortunately, I asked that question because I think a lot of Christianity doesn't necessarily believe that God is at work in any big way in the world. I think they limit it to salvation, and then they see nothing in the world that's good. Not that they don't see good things happening, but they see that the world is spiraling out of control, and that it is under the control of Satan or the devil and the other evil ones. And I think that can be. I think it can be detrimental to how we look at things, and is the Spirit, because the Spirit of God is working in us, and I think the Spirit of God is working in the world. I know that, as Jesus said, his Father is working, I think he's still working, and he's working through us and through the Spirit, us with the Spirit in us, working to get others into his kingdom or into belief in his Son. So I think that if you imagine the world and what you think the world would look like with the Spirit of God working in it, I think the imagining can kind of give us a clue as to where our thought process is with God's thought process. Where are we on the plane with where God is and what he thinks the world should look like? Because I think God definitely has a view of what the world should look like. Even right now, I think he has a view of what the world should look like. And I think imagining shapes the view of our world. Is it the same view that God has? Or is our view skewed by the systems of humanity in its broken state? Last week we called that the sarks. So does that shape what your world view is? And I think that the one thing that we have to be cautious about when we do this is that our minds operate very subjectively. And so each of us, even as believers, might have a different subjective thought about the world, what the world should look like, even as it might operating under the work of the Spirit of God. It's difficult to be objective. And I think that's natural. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it should not discourage us from seeing the world through what God would like to see it, how he would like to see it. And I have a small illustration, and my life is it's work and home and sleep. So I have an illustration I'm going to use from work. So because I work 40 plus hours a week, and that's where I spend a good amount of my time, and it's good because it's structured. And the company I work for is a fairly principled company, and the illustration I want to use is, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but we have guiding principles or guiding goals that we are supposed to use, especially in management, before we make any decision, whether it involves how we are setting up products and displays, how we're treating customers or treating our people. So there's 5 things, and those things are always to be in the forefront of our minds as we go through and conduct our business. And those 5 things haven't changed. And I've been with this company for 23 years. Hard to imagine it's gone that fast. But those 5 things have always been the same. Now, you can call them sets or subsets of other goals or other things that come in there. And some of those have changed and become different over the years. But these 5 things always are the things that we keep in our minds. And, I'm not perfect. So there are times where I make decisions or I do things, and I have done so without considering these 5 principles. And numerous times when I've done that, it's become obvious and I've run into some trouble, which would be not every time, but sometimes. And I think that would be expected. So mostly, though, these 5 things for me, at least when I'm at work, sometimes when I think about it are second nature, because I don't really think about them all the time. After 23 years of being there, it just happens. And they don't require absolute attention or thought. So I think this is how it should be with our worldview as believers. There are guiding principles in the scriptures that show us what God is looking for from us and what he thinks that the world should look like even today. And again, as with anything else, there are some guiding principles. I didn't come up with a numbered amount or anything tonight. There are other things, we can call them subsets, or different sets, because there's different topics in Scripture. There's, different things, especially in the New Testament, that we see. But I think that if we look at the relationship between the people of the world, which we'll see as Israel, and what God expected from them, he had an idea in his mind of what the world should look like and what was Israel's role in making that happen. And so you can see by reading throughout the Old Testament that Israel they didn't keep those guiding principles in mind at all. And eventually that showed. And the result was that they ceased to be a nation, because they could no longer be a nation, because they weren't functioning for the purpose that God had set out for them to do. So we're going to read some of these from the Old Testament. They are repeated in the New Testament, especially by Jesus and Paul, but we're not going to go through every single one of them because we simply don't have time. Many of these are described in the Mosaic Law. And my caution to that would be that since so much of the Mosaic Law revolves around the culture and the times of the people, we can't look at all of that. We're going to look at the basics. And I think when even Jesus was talking to folks, some of those laws he contradicted and said, no, something different. You've heard this, but I'm telling you now, this is what it is. And so as I go through this, just as almost every lesson so far about this I'm not talking about legal applications of Mosaic law. So if we take Israel as an example, I think we can really narrow down what some of these principles are and how they should shape our imagination of the Spirit working in the world, and how these things should be in the forefront of our minds. Everything we say, the actions we take, the reactions we have from experiences that happen to us in the world, from other people or from groups, or even from the systems that we live in, every thought, these should be a filter. And I don't want to limit it to these. I said there's different things, but we're just going to go over this one set of things. So before I get started, these principles to me apply to the kingdom of God. So they are what I believe when God views the world, this is what he thinks the world should look like under his rule. And I say under his rule because I'm starting to see and understand that God, his kingdom is here and he is the ruler. Now, I know a lot of people, and even myself, would say that Satan is the god of this world. Well, Satan was the god of this world. But I know that Paul says in Colossians that Christ was paraded and lifted victoriously over the powers and principalities of not only the world, but of the heavens. And he is ruling right now. So what should life on earth look like? And I think much of what we're going to see is if we imagine what life is like in heaven, and this is what God has in heaven, and he wants it to be like that here. Sometimes I wonder if we're so in tune to things in scriptures being, we're looking for something miraculous, right? We're looking for huge things to happen, and it's something that we can see and grab onto. But I think we should move beyond that and look at just everyday life. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. If we followed these, if believers followed these, just believers, of which there are millions and millions around the world would be a vastly different place than it is today. And unfortunately, it's not. Lastly, we must see ourselves as Paul says we are, which is citizens of another world altogether, which is heaven. We're citizens of the kingdom of Jesus Christ and none other. So you're free to disagree with me, but I believe that my complete responsibility is to that kingdom. It is to Jesus Christ and to God. And it's not to any power on this earth. Now, I'm not saying that I should be a zealot like Simon and fight against the powers of the earth, because I shouldn't be. Jesus says I should pay my taxes. Paul says I should pay my taxes. And Paul says if there are laws in the country you live in, you should follow them. And I think you should. When I say complete responsibility, I mean God's kingdom, or the kingdom of Jesus Christ, which is in God's kingdom. That is my residency. And I need to show that while I'm living in this world. These principles have nothing to do whatsoever with any worldly power structure of any kind, whether it be enforcement, whether it be political, local, or on a global stage or national stage. These things might happen. There might be laws that we have that try to ensure these things happen, but knowing that the world is full of people in a broken human state, they don't always happen, and things happen that shouldn't happen. And these principles are heavenly in origin. And so what we're looking at is a picture of what God is looking for. What happens in heaven that should be happening here as well. And so we're going to start off looking at God, his people, and him being theirs. And we're going to start in Exodus chapter 6. I have a lot of scriptures to go through, so I'm not necessarily going to give you time to turn. But if you remember your sword drills and you're really fast, then you're in good practice. You can keep up, maybe. So Exodus chapter 6 and verse 7, and all my scriptures tonight will be from the NRSV. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has freed you from the burdens of the Egyptians. So God, in that moment, is giving them a statement that you are my people, and I am your God, and I have freed you from the burdens of the Egyptians. Now, we know Egypt is a picture of the world, and I would take this, even if I was to imagine Paul saying something like this, I am God's people, and God has freed me from the burden of sin, and he's freed me from the burden of the broken human nature, just as he did for the people of Israel against the Egyptians. In Deuteronomy 4:20, it says, but the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron smelter, out of Egypt, to become a people of his very own possession, as you are now. So in their present time, right then, they were God's people. They were his very own possession. So God chose them to be his. Out of all the people on the earth, he chose them. I didn't put this verse down, but in one place it says that he chose them, not exactly word for word, but the idea being that they were the small group compared to the big group, the minority to be put into the majority. And why did he do that? Well, Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3 says, I will make of you a great nation. And of course, he's talking to Abraham. And I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Israel was to be a nation of priests. And who were they to be priests to? Not just among themselves, but to the world. Now, I'm not a priest, and I don't think that God has made me a priest. However, God has a purpose for me. And his purpose for me, through me, is that I would be a blessing, not only to other believers when I'm at church or talking to you like I am now, but when I'm in the world. His goal is still the restoration of all of creation, the restoration of all of humanity. And that is one of the reasons, if not, besides worshiping, probably the primary reason I'm on this earth is for that. The very reason that Israel was here as God's people is the very reason that we are here as God's people. And you wonder, did Paul say anything like that? Well, I think we could probably go to almost every epistle and hear him say something like that. But I chose Titus 2:14, and it says, "He it is who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify for himself a people of his own who are zealous for good deeds." And as soon as I read the word zealous, I think of, as I said a minute ago, Simon the Zealot. And why was he a zealot? What were zealots? Zealots were people who were so against the Roman Empire that they engaged on a regular basis in activities that would try to bring down the Roman Empire, whether in large chunks or just right in their neighborhood. Simon was a zealot. Paul was a zealot. Not the same kind of zealot Simon was. Paul was a zealot for the law. He was a zealot for the old covenant. He was a zealot to the point that he went around and he had people arrested and imprisoned, or worse. We know that he was there for Stephen's stoning, and that he held the coats, which meant, and he held the coats that meant that he was there supporting what they were doing. Paul was zealous, and he even said as such, I believe, in Galatians. He was zealous. We have been chosen to be a people of God, freed from iniquity and purified by the work of Jesus Christ, to be zealous for God, zealous for good works. So in the Greek, like I just said, the word is a zealot. And so that's what we are. That's what he's looking for. He's looking for people that will actively, every day in their life, whether they're going to work, hanging out at the mall, talking to people that aren't believers, whatever they do, they are zealous for God's kingdom. Zealous, because God is constantly trying to add to it and get everybody into it. And that's what we're for. So it's not rarely, it's not once in a while I'm zealous. He wants us to do it every day in every moment. Recently at work, I had to have a conversation with someone for some performance issues and attendance issues. And in it, I kind of jokingly said, I'm going to be really demanding. I not only want you to do a good job on your work, but I want you to be here every day. And that is exactly what God's looking for. It sounds demanding, and it is demanding, but there are big things in the making that God is doing, and we're part of that. And he wants us to be a part of that. And it's a shame we're not. Now, there's not going to be a curse on you if you're not part of it, or you're not zealous. Because we're people, and by nature that we're not always on board constantly 100% of the time, and God knows that. And thankfully, he's very gracious, especially with us today since the cross. But nonetheless, it is what he's looking for. So from Israel's establishment, and I meant to look at how long this was, and I didn't. So you'll have to look it up yourself, and I'm going to definitely look it up probably tonight. From the time Israel became who they were to the book of 1 Samuel, I don't know how many years that was, but hundreds upon hundreds, I'm going to imagine. And through all that time, once they became a nation, taken out of Israel, put into their promised land and became a nation, there was a very long period of time that Israel functioned without a king. But they did not really function without a king. They had a king, just not a king that was sitting on a throne that they can walk up and touch and feel every day, or would be in a palace on a throne. Instead, their king was in a temple, and he resided in the Holy of Holies, and he was there with them before they actually took their land and were able to build the tabernacle and such, or they had the tabernacle. Their king went before them as a column of fire at night, or a column of clouds by the day. So their king was with them. Their king did things for them. Their king made sure they had water. He made sure they had food. He made sure they had clothing. He made sure that they were protected. He went through the land before them to push people out so that they could settle the land. He did a lot for Israel as a king. And he did not do the things that he said that a king would do should they ever want one, which eventually they did. I think in the past couple of weeks, I don't know what week exactly, I mentioned that some of the importance of the book of Judges is because it shows how God wanted Israel to exist on this earth without a king. So there was a system, but we can't look at it as a power structure like we think of it as a power structure. So in the system, God placed judges, which weren't to be thought of as rulers, because God was the ruler. And we can see the beginnings of the thoughts with this with Moses, because his father-in-law talks to him about it. And I'm going to be in Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 to 23. It says, the next day that Moses sat as judge for the people, while the people stood around him from morning until evening. Now you got to imagine, Israel was very large at this time. And this is a daily thing, I bet, for Moses, right? From the time he gets up to the time that he goes to bed, he is listening to the people of Israel, listening to their grievances that they have against each other, listening to their grievances he has against them, against God and everything else. And he is taking these things to God and making decisions on them based on what God says in God's law. And Moses' father-in-law was there, and he says in verse 14, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone while all the people stand around you from morning until evening?" Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people of God come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make known to them the statutes and instructions of God." Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you, for the task is too heavy for you, and you cannot do it alone. Now listen to me, and I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. You should represent the people before God, and you should bring their cases before God. Teach them the statutes and instructions, and make known to them the way they are to go about things and the things they do. You should also look for able men among all the people, men who fear God and trustworthy and hate dishonest gain. Set such men over them as officers of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Let them sit as judges for the people at all times. Let them bring every important case to you, but decide every minor case themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, you will be able to endure, and all these people will go home in peace. So it says in verse 21 that they are officers, and some, I think the King James says rulers, and others say other things that give the idea that they are rulers, but I don't think we should perceive them as rulers as we imagine them today. These men are officers, more in a legal sense, concerning the law and statutes that God gave them and how they should live. And so in verse 19, these men should be judging according to what God says. And they should be people, in verse 21, who are trustworthy, men who fear God, and men who are honest. So they would not use the advantage of their position to take advantage of people who are poor, or they might not take advantage of the situation. If a massive family came and we're getting down on one particular person, he wouldn't side with the family against the person just because they're family or good friends. They were people who were honest, and they were going to do the absolute right thing. So that is what we see from that time after Moses set it up all through the book of Judges. We see these men that were placed among over certain people in a form of, this is what God says, this is what God's statutes are, this is how we live, this is how we act. That's what these men were for. And that is exactly how God wanted it to be. God's the king. It's his kingdom. Israel is the manifestation of that in the world. They live according to what their king says, but knowing that people are going to have grievances and things are going to come up, there were people in the world that they could go to that would represent them before God, and God, through these men, would make sure that the people were being pointed in the right direction and living properly. Now, in the book of Judges, I think we could see that obviously starting to break down, because the people of Israel were doing things that were evil. They were worshiping as they should not worship, following after other nations and those nations' gods, and most likely not following the precepts and statutes of God, just in general. And so that happening, we know God withdrew to an extent and allowed his wrath to work out in them just because of how they were acting among these other nations. And that's the idea we have all the way through Judges and even into Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, it says in verse 15 to 17 that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He judged Israel just like Ehud judged Israel, or Deborah, or any of the other judges that we read of, and the things that they did to God did through them to free Israel from oppression. Samuel did the same thing. So when you read chapter 1 through chapter 7, we read of Samuel's birth, the circumstances surrounding that for his mother, that he becomes a judge or a prophet of God, and pretty much lives only for God. And Israel gets itself into trouble, and he is the prophet or the one that tells Israel what to do and how they get out of it, which did happen. So Samuel judged them all the days of his life. It says in verse 16, he went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would come back to Ramah, for his home was there. He administered justice there to Israel and built there an altar to the Lord. We know that didn't last Samuel's entire lifetime, because just near the end of his life, when his sons were supposed to be stepping up in place of him, working for their king, who was God, his sons perverted justice. Because in chapter 8, verses 3 through 5, it says, yet his sons did not follow in his ways, or in God's ways, we could insert there, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like all the other nations." And then down in verse 7, God tells Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being a king over them." So the people finally reject God straight out, and they want a king. They want a system like everybody else has, where they have a king. He was a human being to rule over them and not God. So it said, we just read in Samuel that he judged the people from his home in Ramah after he did the circuit every year. And I don't know how long he was at home, but he judged from there. And it says that he made sure that Israel followed God's ways. And the word used is justice. So next we're going to look at the emphasis that God places on justice. Now, I've mentioned the Bible Project podcast, and I don't know if any of you have listened to it yet, but I'll mention it again. And I hope if you have the means that you would take some time to listen, because it's really good. So what is justice? Throughout the Old Testament, God talks about justice. And justice has numerous ideas that come under it. But when you get to the prophets, you read things related directly towards justice that did not happen, that Israel did the exact opposite of, not exactly what God was looking for. So I think this is one of the principles I talked about before, and I think it applies because these ways of justice apply to everyone, not just believers. But I think that believers, as Israel was, were to display these because this was one of the ways that God was going to get other people to look and see this is what he has for them. If you look at, God had a vision for the world, and he had a vision for Israel to live a certain way and to act a certain way with him as their king, not with a human king. Because when the other nations saw them, they would have seen there's a nation that has no king. They don't have any princes. They don't have the power structure. They don't have the military. They don't have all this, yet somehow they managed to live together in a peaceful way. And they managed to display that even towards us. And that is what God wanted everyone to see. And I think that if they had done that and people would have seen that, eventually it would have started to pique the interest of these other nations. And they might have seen a way to come to God. But that's not what happened. And we know that's not what happened. So what I want to do is go through some verses and just look at some of the things of justice. Now, I'm not going to read all these verses verbatim because I just don't have the time, but I'm going to say a chapter that they're in and just go through some of the things, and you can, of course, take the time to look up these things for yourself. And a lot of these things we could say as Mosaic law, but none of them are the particular things that have to do with the feasts or the sacrificing. None of them have to do with what we might think of as cultural or societal things that were in the law to the people at that time. Every single one of these things could apply to humans generally, even to us today. So the first group is in Exodus 23, and we read in there that they are not to spread false reports. They are not to follow the majority when bearing witness in a lawsuit. They are not to follow the majority in their perversions of justice. They are not to show partiality towards the rich and powerful against the poor. They are not to kill the innocent. They are not to kill those who are in the right. And they are not to bring false charges. So in that group of things, we see there's no spreading of things that are not true. There is no following the majority just because they're the majority. And if the minority are the ones in the right, we don't squash them and leave them rotting in jail so that those who are rich and powerful can have their way. And death there is killing is pretty straightforward, not killing the innocent, and not in any way getting rid of somehow by death those people who are right because it doesn't suit the purposes of the majority, and not bringing false charges against people. All things that are normal, everyday things that should be occurring. And you got to keep in mind as we read these are in a land, in a nation that has no king, earthly king. Their king resides in heaven, and in their tabernacle, or eventually in their temple. Of course, when it was a temple, they had a king, but their king wasn't someone that you could physically see. All these things were self-policing, self-responsibility based on God's law. In Leviticus 19, they were supposed to leave all the gleanings of their fields and vineyards for the poor and for the aliens, people who weren't Israelites but were living in their lands, and we know that those people existed. Also, same thing it says in Deuteronomy 24. It says no stealing, no lying from or to your neighbor. You don't steal from your neighbor, and you don't lie to your neighbor. You treat the deaf and the blind respectfully and do not take advantage of them. And I think you can spread that out to anybody who has physical ailments or is less than someone who is completely whole. We don't take advantage of them, and we treat them with the same respect we treat everybody else with. It says you may not take vengeance or bear a grudge. You may not slander or profit from death of a neighbor, from the death of a neighbor. And I would spread that out to a neighbor who, again, is less fortunate. Maybe they're missing an arm or a leg and can't do everything you can do. Maybe they're not mentally all there. And so that people or groups of people might have a reason or a way to take advantage of others. We're not to do that. You may not make unjust judgments or defer to the rich in justice over the poor. That's a frequent one. In Deuteronomy 10, God says you may not take bribes because God does not take bribes. You may not be partial because God is impartial. God executes justice for the widows, for the orphans, for the poor, and the strangers in the land. Therefore, you should execute justice for the orphan, the widows, the poor, and the strangers. You do this by providing them with food and clothing. And early in the chapter, God says it is required of Israel to do these things. Required. It's not a suggestion. It's not like these are things that you could do and this will make you a good person, or these are the things that good people do. God is saying it is what is required of you. These are basic functions of what it means to be a human being. In Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 to 20, it says, you shall appoint judges and officials throughout your tribes in all the towns that the Lord your God has given you, and they shall render decisions for the people. It says that they may not distort justice, they may not show partiality, accept bribes, because bribes blind the eyes of the wise and subvert the causes for those who are right. So justice and only justice you shall pursue. So we can read all through Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, things about justice and what God expected. But we know in the prophets that's not what he found. In Isaiah, in chapter 5, it says that he is exalted by justice and that he shows himself holy through righteousness. But we read in chapter 1 of Isaiah that God proclaims Jerusalem has become a whore because they pervert justice. He expected to find justice, but he found bloodshed. We find that frequently throughout Isaiah, Jeremiah, and a few times in Ezekiel. And numerous times we find justice in the book of Isaiah. We find it regarding the one he is sending, the Messiah, and how when the Messiah comes, he will show justice to the world. And we see that in Isaiah 42. It says that he will put his spirit in him, and he will bring forth justice to the nations. It says that in verse 3, he will faithfully bring forth justice, and he's going to do it gently. Unfortunately, we can't look all these up because there's just not enough time. But if you look up the word justice in a concordance, or if you have some kind of computer software like eStored, which again is completely free, you can look up the word justice and the word orphan, poor, widow, and aliens, and you will find out what justice is according to God. And of course, we know that Israel also sought after other gods. They were idolatrous, and these were also some of the reasons that they did not continue as a nation. But I think you'll see that the prophets looked towards a future one, or Messiah, who was going to restore justice and peace. And you will find greatly through these verses that God loves justice. Ezekiel 22 verses 6 to 12, you should read those. They give a really good condensed view, more than the rest, of exactly what justice is. Of course, they're in a negative light looking at things that Israel did, but you can read them all in one place and you can see this is what God's looking for. It talks about keeping the Sabbaths and other things, but it also talks about all the other things we just said, and they were things that were not happening, even to the point of taking advanced interest and accruing interest against others in wrongful ways, extortion, and in doing all these things. It talks about acts of sexuality against neighbors' wives, and such. And God says that they did those things because they had forgotten him, and they forgot what his view of the world is. And so when you read these things, what do we imagine that the world looks like if the Spirit of God was at work in it? And I'll share with you my own. And these might seem lofty, and they might seem utopian, and in many ways they are. But I want to reiterate to you, these things happen outside of the power structures of the world. The power structures of the world might offer some of these things, and they might want to do some of these things, but I think that we can see how that's going. One thing I think that's really absent in our world today, and that is believers active in communities. I'm not just talking about, a soup kitchen, talking about real action and sharing what God has for the people of the world. And I think that this vision that we see of justice, it's not some far off thing that's down in the future. I think God has an actual view of this is what the world should look like, and us, are my people. And I want them to be zealous for these things, and I want them to go out into the world, and I want them to work. Let me work through them to see these things happen. And so when I look at what I think God views the world as, or how he thinks the world should be, I don't think there should be any hungry people. There should not be people without clothing or shelter. People should be treated with respect and honor. People are not robbed of their time, money, homes, or possessions. And people do not take advantage of others. And honestly, I think violence is something that's completely unknown. The love for others is so overwhelming that no one lacks anything. No one in need is turned away for any reason at all. And the life and love of Jesus and the Father are plainly visible to everyone. And all this is accomplished completely free of any worldly power, political system, or structure. It is accomplished by God through the people of God. So obviously not everyone in the world is a person of God. Not everyone in the world is going to see the need for all these things for everybody. There are people in the world who are going to take advantage. There are political organizations, there are charitable organizations who claim to do these things, and yet money and time and energy is wasted. And we know that there are people who have been found guilty of extortion from things like this, and that's the broken human nature. And that's why it cannot be left to any power structure or system of the world. It can only happen in the fullest way through the people that God has, his people, who was us. That is the vision that he had for Israel. That's the vision that he saw the rest of the world seeing. And that's why when they didn't do it, and that's why he spent so much time in the prophets talking about how they perverted justice, because those things they perverted, they forgot him and they forgot what they were there for. And because of that, they not only perverted it for themselves, but they perverted it for the rest of the world. The rest of the world was not living in a general sense in justice. And God had put someone there to show them what that looked like. So like I said, these are highlights, and I encourage you to go back and look through these things. And I'm not saying that if, 1,000 Christians got together in a certain city and did something, I'm sure that changes could be made and things could happen. And that's exactly what we're talking about. But it could just be one or two people doing things. And it might only affect a couple people. But the more people that are doing things and the more people that are letting the Spirit work through them, the more we would truly see the Spirit of God working in the world, because the Spirit of God is working in the world today, in us. And I believe outside of us also, and to the extent that he's trying to draw others to him. But we are that temple or that tabernacle right now. And it's through us that God is working. We're his habitation in the world. Paul says as much. We are those that are in his kingdom. So I don't think the Spirit of God is absent in the world today. And I know a lot of things happen in the world that we won't say are positive, but I think just giving up and having a total pessimistic view, and Jesus is coming back someday, and it doesn't really matter what happens because, God has it all under control. I think those are all wrong ways to look at it. And if not only for the fact that it causes Christians and believers to take a back seat, and not really accomplish what God has us here to accomplish. And so next week, we will be picking up in Romans again in verses 8, 9 to 13. I'm not going to read them now because of the time. I was going to read them, but you can take a look at those. And next week we will continue. But for now, just give that thought. What should we be doing as believers? And, not only should we be telling people about what Jesus did on the cross and what his salvation does for us, but we should be telling them this is what it's like to live as someone who has understood that, and to live under God's rule. Amen.